All right, boys and girls, we are back for another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us, as always, at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. I'm happy to be joined today by David Azerrad. He is assistant professor at Hillsdale College in Washington, D.C. David, thanks so much for taking the time to join us again today.
Happy to be back, Ben.
I want to talk to you about a number of different things related both to politics and conservatism and the election. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this anniversary that is being marked this Thanksgiving, but also is being, because of the 400-year anniversary, a major aspect of discussion among a lot of different folks. At the Federalist, we've been running a series called the 1620 Project, looking back at the Pilgrims, the Puritans who came after, and a number of the different ways that they affected the origin of America. We do not make the claim that the New York Times did, that it is in some sense a new American founding or redefined American founding. But we do think that there are a lot of elements of their character that were critical in the formation of the country and led into a lot of aspects of the American idea. I'm curious as to your reaction to some of those essays that we've been running thus far, and just to the general concept of something that, frankly, it's not very much in vogue to go back and appreciate a bunch of dead white people who came over the sea to form what ended up being an enormously influential element of the American experience.
My first reaction is to commend you for doing that, and also to lament the fact that the country as a whole is not celebrating this anniversary. I mean, I guess we're not surprised given the state of things these days, but what does it say about a nation that it is ashamed and ignorant of its past, that we're not capable of celebrating the admirable courage of these people? You asked me what I think of them. So I know I'm with you. The founding is 1776, but there's 150 years of history before that matters immensely. I always chide my neocon friends with that is, it takes a particular type of human being to be capable of being free. We tend to, yes, all men are created equal, but then they're shaped by regimes that make most of them utterly unfit for liberty. And what makes America extraordinary is that we had this, first of all, these people who came here, who had a particular character, Tocqueville calls them, I've always loved this line, pious adventurers. And it's a really nice combination of two aspects of their character. So the obvious piety that we all know, they were zealous Christians. It was taken to certain excesses. Tocqueville criticizes the laws that were passed in New England at the time. He says they were bizarre or tyrannical. They were punishing adultery, witchcraft, long hair, tobacco. But there was also something good about it that, they were pious Christians who took their duties to God seriously. But then there's the adventurous side that, I always admired about Americans, and that regrettably is waning. I mean, compare the risk that they took, the real manliness they displayed in crossing that ocean, landing in this wild land with, as Tocqueville puts it, wild animals and wild people, with the pathetic response of our elites today to COVID. A disease that is, the mortality rate is what at this point? I mean, if you're not above 80 and you don't have an underlying condition, what are the odds of you passing away? And we're reacting, at least those in charge are, like scared, pathetic little creatures. There's something of that hardy, old manliness that I think the Pilgrims remind us of. So I think it's very important to study and remember this part of our history because it's a constitutive element of who we are. And without romanticizing it and saying, I want to recreate Puritan America, I do think there are things to learn there. To me, the two main are, one is this hardiness, the boldness they demonstrated. And then the other is the one that Tocqueville also praises, is the spirit of self-government. I mean, he says they came with the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty. And even though the aims of government as they understood them are not those of the founders, i.e., it is not salvation, they really demonstrated an admirable capacity to govern themselves. I mean, part of it is the English heritage, But here are these people who came, and the first thing they did was to covenant with one another. They were quite democratic. I mean, Tocqueville invokes ancient Athens, saying we haven't seen something like this since ancient Athens. And this remains something that has set America apart. I mean, Americans know how to do things on their own. Less so today, of course, but that spirit is still alive. So I wholeheartedly commend the Federalists for what they're doing, and hope that all Americans will overcome the biases of the bad education we receive to return to the Puritans and look at them more carefully.
I can tell you that we've had a lot of people reach out to us from academia. We've had teachers and professors and others reach out to us since we started running these pieces, wanting to acquire a collection of them for them to use, which we will be providing free of charge, a PDF that they can, ready for them to download and print and share with the classroom at the end of this, which we're going to run these essays through December 21st, which is the anniversary of the arrival at Plymouth Rock. And to me, one of the aspects of this, you say that, the element of boldness and of courage, to me, is also kind of paired with a little bit of extreme foolishness. I mean, looking back at this, it is kind of America's original "they didn't drink but hold my beer" moment. Like we're just gonna go across the ocean. They had all these different problems along the way. They were woefully unprepared for what they came across, but then they got through it. And I think that there's a certain aspect of that in America's history too, that without that kind of daring, you're not able to make these kind of great leaps. One additional element of this, obviously, though, too, is what led them originally to make that choice, which is, of course, their frustrations with the level of religious freedom that they were experiencing in Europe. To me, that's another element of them that we should appreciate in this moment in the context of this pandemic, because we see, across the country, so many objections related to religious experience and to the eagerness of people to continue their ability to worship, something that I think if people think that Thanksgiving is controversial, just wait till we get to Christmas, because people are absolutely, when you have the combined, sort of centrality of that holiday in America's capitalist experience with the religious elements involved, then, you have a real brew for some real controversy, ones that will probably end up in the courts, and that have increased with the frustrations of people who see that casinos and strip clubs can be open, but you can't go and gather to worship as you see fit. Tell me a little bit about the religious element of the Pilgrims and the Puritans as being something that had a through line to 1776, and how you think about that in its current place today, where so many Americans are unchurched, not just non-believers, but people who have no interest in religion, and how that has changed the way that we view that as something that historically has been central to America's experience.
Well, this is where I see, an important break between 1620 and 1776. I mean, the religious liberty is not a Puritan principle.
Mm-hmm.
There were, I forget in which colony it was, but that they had it on the books that Catholic priests who returned to the colony after being expelled once would get the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
So they wanted to worship God as they saw fit, but they were not tolerant and welcoming to those who disagreed with their way of worship. So, one thing we need to realize is there was a very important transformation of Protestant theology between 1620 and 1776.
Yes.
It wasn't an abandonment of Protestant theology. I mean, as you well know, the overwhelming majority of Americans who fought in the Revolution, who wrote pamphlets, who delivered sermons, were Protestants. But there was I hesitate to call it a Lockeanizing of Protestantism, because I don't think it's the work of John Locke, but exclusively, but it's bringing in the conception of rights into Protestant Christianity, mm-hmm. including, of course, the idea of religious liberty.
Yes.
And so I think one can say that without denying the fact that there is some continuity, but it's important to notice the change, and that's a big one. To me, when I think of the religious aspects of the Puritan, what appeals to me most is, and look, I, I mean, I'm a Canadian Jew, so I tread carefully when I speak of American Christianity or Christianity in general, but I see a lot of Christianity today, I feel, is quite weak and watered down. And some people say, well, yes, that's the essence of Christianity. But you look at, historically speaking, an awful lot of pious Christians didn't understand their religion that way. And that's one of the things I admire about the Puritans, is this, and their heirs, is this manlier Christianity. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, and we're not going to get into theological discussion of what is real Christianity. But let's just say that the people for a long time in this country who understood themselves to be Orthodox Christians had a much more robust conception of what Christianity entails than a lot of Christians today. And while I would not want, as I said, I'm not counseling a return to Puritanism in America today. Although, we've got the secularized left-wing version of it rampant
Yes.
in the academy, the corporations, the media. That spirit of Puritanism is alive and well. It's that is the dimension I find interesting, and I think is worth all Americans, Christian or not, worth considering more carefully.
So you actually anticipated my next question, which is, do you actually see the inheritors of Puritanism today as being more on the Christian right or on the woke left?
Well, I mean, to ask the, the answer to that. I mean, the Christian right is timid, it's defeated, and with the exception of life, there really is no issue where it fights ruthlessly and with bold self-confidence. It's, I think, retreating on all fronts, timid, um, constantly accommodating the pieties of the left. How many American Christians have accepted the idea that anti-racism is the heart of Christianity? And of course, it goes without saying, that is not to say that real Christianity is racist. That's nonsense. But this idea that the central piety of the left should also be the central piety of Christianity. But that spirit of persecution, that the ugly side of Puritanism, of imposing your comprehensive morality on everyone.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean that's this. I mean, I always feel that this is not based on an exhaustive comparative analysis of all Western nations, but I often feel that we have the worst left in America, the most fanatical, intolerant, and exhausting left that there is. Part of it is probably the American, the extent of the Puritan DNA. Part of it is probably because we also have the best organized right of anywhere in the West, and so the left feels threatened in a way that they don't feel in Canada or in France. And so they really think that we're this close to, a white supremacist takeover of the country because of the NRA and Donald Trump. And so they're on a heightened state of alert. But the end result is, it is exhausting. That said, you do have to somehow admire the zeal they have. I always often say that I wish that the right would fight with the same clarity of purpose, resolve, and ruthlessness with which the left fights.
Well, I certainly think that would make a significant change in the attitudes of both right and left if that fight was engaged to that degree.
Well, we're getting there.
Well, I think, though, for instance, of the announcement just this past week that that they would not be pursuing further investigation against the folks who went after Rand Paul and his wife and their friend in the streets of D.C. following the president's acceptance speech. And it seems to me that that's the kind of thing that under a left administration would absolutely be a priority, no matter the member involved or anything along those lines. I do think that there's a degree of ruthlessness in the gap there that you're very honestly assessing. One question that I had, and this leads us into 2020 and modern politics, is it seems to me that you have been articulating and have been part of a group of people articulating uh, a, a number of different disagreements with the establishment right, the portion of Republican leadership, basically, that for a long time was uncomfortable in any way addressing the ruthlessness of the left or even acknowledging that it existed. They had a distaste for culture wars. They wanted to stick to a lot of spreadsheets and analytical, green eye shade type conservatism, and that was something.
Occupational licensing reform.
Yes, exactly. Most people don't even know what that means, and
But it's the key to winning all the natural Hispanic and Black voters, natural conservative Hispanic and Black voters.
It's funny to me, David, because we've been listening to this kind of rhetoric for so long that I think that at some point, many people forgot how stupid it is. That just like if you hear a thing often enough, you just sort of nod along with it because you recognize the bullet point, not recognizing the way that it sounds to someone a normal person who doesn't typically pay attention to politics 90% of the time. Coming out of 2020, it seems to me, whatever you can say about the outcome, the idea that occupational licensing reform was going to be the key to reaching out to Hispanic voters across the country has been totally proven false. That the autopsy back in 2012 is shown to be, as I've said before, it is honest in the sense that it is about a party that is dead. And to me, this current coalition is one that a lot of Republican, activists and politicians have claimed that they wanted for a long time: more diverse, more working class. They wanted to be the party of working families and the like. But the way that they got there was not the way that they really wanted to get there. So what do you think that looks like going forward? What do you think the politicians are going to do in terms of how they relate to this new coalition? And do you think that it can be retained by a conservatism that is perhaps more populist, more nationalist in tone, in a way that reaches to people on issues that hit them in their gut, as opposed to what you've just talked about?
Okay, well, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Well, let's start with one thing though, that so everyone on the right is jubilating that Trump got, a larger share of the non-white vote than anyone in, I don't know, 40 years or whatever it is. But Ryan Gadursky, is that how you pronounce his name?
Mm-hmm.
Has pointed out that he got a lower share of the white vote than he did in 2016, and that had he done so, he would have won in 2020. So I would I want to point out that there's something wrong with the right bringing in non-whites into the Republican Party and onto itself, because I often see it as, here we can finally prove to the left that we're not racist. Now will you be nice to us?
Yeah.
And we really accept your definition of we actually have doubts that we're racist, even though our policies are not couched in racial terms, even though the people who vote for us are not racist. The fact that the party is majority white, we're uncomfortable with. So I'm all for broadening the coalition, winning elections, peeling away voters from the Dems. But I am opposed to worshiping at the altar of wokeness, to buying into the nonsense of the diversity guys on the left. And we should push a strong agenda. If it brings in more non-white voters, that's wonderful. But I don't think that that's an end unto itself. The end unto itself is to get a majority coalition, regardless of what it looks like, to win elections and implement sound policies to keep the country going. I mean, to bring it back to greatness. That should be the goal. Now, in terms of, whether or not the Republican establishment and the conservative establishment is going to learn a lesson from this, I'm a bit skeptical because I don't feel they've learned all that many lessons from the past 4 years. I mean, my working hypothesis is they will write off 2016 as, 70,000 votes in 3 states, a vacancy on the Supreme Court, and Hillary Clinton is a horrible candidate. And so Trump won. It turns out that conservative donors and Republican voters like him. So a lot of the Republican establishment and the conservative establishment learned to not attack him. But in terms of fundamental political reorientation, I mean, there are some new platitudes that are being mouthed, but in terms of really learning lessons, fundamentally changing course on, the unrepentant neoconservative foreign policy, on the foolish and dogmatic libertarian economics, on the timidity on fighting the cultural wars. I don't see much evidence that the party, in terms of the people who run it, is eager to change. Whether or not it does remains to be seen. Part of it is what is Trump going to do in the next few years?
That was my next question. Is he effectively, as the 800-pound gorilla who could easily run again in 2024? You have early polling that says the majority of Republican voters would like that. He hit his highest level of popularity this past week, thanks to probably these coronavirus vaccines coming through. And given all of that, do you think that his presence as being that potential threat, does that do anything to keep Republican leaders in line and still put them in that category of we're reluctant to criticize this guy, given how popular he is with the Republican base and with the donor class?
Yes, it may well, but does it lead them to fundamentally rethink? That Rusty Reno had coined this wonderful line, the rotting flesh of Reaganism. I mean, I don't think it's possible to improve upon that one. I think they're going to continue the, don't attack Trump, say some stuff about the working class, but remain committed to the old way of doing things. Now, in terms of his role going forward, I mean, one question is, to what extent is he going to get bogged down in lawsuits? To what extent are they going to come after him? He may end up being somewhat, semi-martyred, and that might be good for the movement. Although I suspect, given his temperament, even if he's embroiled in lawsuits, he's going to keep on fighting. I do, eventually he's going to have to make way for someone else. And that's something I have doubts about. I don't think Trump is very good at, he's good at sharing the stage with subordinates, but he's not good at sharing the stage with equals or superiors. So I do wonder if he'll realize that at one point he's going to need to anoint some sort of a successor. If it's his son, he might be more comfortable doing that. But I look at the party right now. I mean, to me, if you put a gun to my head and you had to say, who would you pick to take up the mantle? I'm not particularly enthusiastic about anyone, but if I had to pick one person, I'd pick Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. My only hesitation is that I feel hasn't been sufficiently tested, i.e., ruthlessly attacked by the left and called a racist. And I've just learned not to trust politicians until they've accumulated a few scars, because that's really what they're made of, because that is ultimately the left's greatest weapon, is the baseless accusation of racism, which is how you destroy people in America today. And that's how they keep people in line. So I like people like Trump or Tucker Carlson who already have scars to show that they've been accused and they didn't apologize and move forward. So I'd pick DeSantis.
One of the elements there, and you bring up Tucker, is that I think is critical to understand about Trump's appeal, is that people outside of the media industry and outside of New York viewed him perhaps inaccurately, as a traitor to his class,
Who is
which
this,
to
Trump or Tucker?
Trump, but I think that that's also true of Tucker now in a certain way. He's viewed as kind of being of Washington elite, but someone who's a constant critic of it. How important is that, do you think, just in the concept of what this post-Trump more populist party might represent? Because it seems to me you're almost better positioned if you're someone who basically can come to the people and say, I know what the inside is like. I know what the elites are like, and they hate me and they hate you. And I'm going to be the truth teller, the person, bringing you the thing that the elites don't want you to hear. That to me is always it's such a powerful thing, as opposed to the people who seem like they appeal to the corporate boardroom, the Mitt Romneys of the world, who are perfect from the perspective of the donor class and the corporate world, but have nothing of that kind of traitor to that element, which to me is just such a powerful thing within the realm of a populist cultural focused campaign.
I agree with you, but let me add two caveats.
Mm-hmm.
That I'm sympathetic to populism, but the two reservations I have about the outlook and the term are: one, you need an elite. I mean, we can't be the party only of plumbers, truckers, and electricians. There is nothing wrong with these professions, but we need to find some way, yes, to criticize the rotten ruling class we have, but to also signal that there is room in the party for college educated urban people who love this country, and that we're not just the party of the deplorables, of the forgotten men and women of this country. So one needs to be careful with that. The other one is, the other blind spot of populism is a tendency to idealize and romanticize the people.
Yes.
And I think there is plenty of virtue left in the American people, which is one of the reasons that I am not black-pilled like some of my friends are. I'm not willing to give up on a country in which 73 million people voted for someone who they had been told for the past 4 years was basically some sort of a Nazi.
Yeah.
I'm not willing to give up on a people who own and know how to use firearms in the extent that Americans do. I'm not willing to give up on a people who have the moral courage to criticize abortion. I'm not willing to give up on a people who have the moral courage to affirm that they're pro-life in a culture that is so hostile to that point of view. I'm not willing to give up on a people who have the courage to affirm their Christian convictions in a culture that is so ruthlessly hostile to Orthodox Christianity. You saw those, what were they called? Those boat rallies for Trump. What were they called? You know what I'm
the boat parades,
the boat parades,
yeah,
and the truck parades. I mean,
yes,
there's a lot there to rouse the spirit. That being said, this is something that I understand why Tucker Carlson and Donald Trump don't talk about that. But if one wants to have a clear-eyed assessment of the country, one needs to realize that there are some serious problems plaguing Middle America. The obesity, the drug addiction, the bad habits of pornography, the decay of the family. I don't want to get into this with you, but the watching too much sports and playing too many video games, which you and I disagree about the virtue of these things. I refuse. I point this out not in saying, and therefore the American people are rotten, but one should be aware of, and that's one of the blind spots of populism. So I want to take what's good about the populist impulse, but make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that we need an elite, and that we should think of how to revitalize aspects of the people that are not doing as well as we'd want them to do.
Is there a place in America that politicians who want to look to the future and consider the importance of this coalition ought to be looking at geographically? Is there a city? Is there a town? Something that appeals to you in terms of this is a place that people ought to pay more attention to because it resembles a lot of what's going on in the country?
And that's a good question, Ben. I don't have a good answer. Nothing comes to mind immediately. I need to think about it.
Sure. I realize I'm putting you on the spot. It does seem to me that one aspect of this that that really sticks out to me is a lack of awareness on the part of the left about a really critical flaw with their agenda. When people talk about socialism and things like that, yes, I think that definitely hurt them among the Hispanic community. But there's a bigger problem there, which is that they, and I think that many lefties would be honest with you when they say this, that they had an outreach program basically run by people who are part of the 3%, according to Pew,
2%.
that
Latinx?
that uses Latinx. Yes.
I thought it was 2%. Okay.
Maybe it's a rounding error. The fact is that no one uses that term. Okay, they just don't, and the vast majority of American Hispanics are unfamiliar with it. And so when you ask, why does Donald Trump and Republicans just run roughshod through the Rio Grande Valley? People who from the perspective of NPR should be totally opposed to his immigration message and the like. Well, it's because a lot of them are cops or people who work for Border Patrol or who have jobs in those things. And so when they hear defund the police, it's not that they think that necessarily Joe Biden is a socialist, but they feel like the people around him are people who are opposed to law and order and who will lead to people running over the border to a much greater degree, to problems and to strife. They're worried about things happening in Mexico and the ramifications of a Biden immigration policy that could revert to the way it was before, which they remember, and which was not particularly popular under Obama and Biden. And so, to me, if there was one place that I would look, it would basically be look at these border issues, look at these ICE and cop and defund the police issues more through the lens of the family that is very much in love with America, and that you may view through a racial lens because you've been programmed to think about it that way by our national media, but they have no idea the way that they actually think about these issues and the priorities that they actually have.
Yeah, on this point, let me add to what you said. I don't have polling evidence to back this up, but I strongly suspect that a significant share of the Hispanic and Black vote that Trump got in 2020 was driven by the barbaric violence that we saw in American cities after the death of George Floyd. And that the working class message has something to do with it. But I think that there's just a lot more common sense amongst people than we realize, and that when one party is either excusing or encouraging or keeping silent while cities are being burned down, and another one is led by a man who, for all his faults, is saying no to this, tends to be a pretty clear moral choice for many people. So I think it would be interesting to before one gets too excited about the prospects for a permanent realignment, I wonder how much of this non-white vote was driven as a response to the Antifa and BLM this summer.
In addition, I would say that I think that, and this is going to be difficult to research, but I have talked to now more than one pollster who believes it. They believe that the summer is really where the polls started getting inaccurate in a lot of these senses, because people were unwilling to tell pollsters what they honestly thought about Black Lives Matter and about a lot of these movements, because they thought it would make them sound racist. And that to me is, yes, I think people are worried about cancel culture, especially upper class people. The shy Trump voter definitely was a thing, made a huge difference in the House races and the legislative races. But I also think that one of the underrated elements of how badly these propagandistic polls got it wrong is the kind of pressure to, as they say in Seinfeld, who will not wear the ribbon?
You need to wear the ribbon. I mean, just use your common sense. You get a phone call from an unknown number, and some person wants to ask you, in this climate, what are your views on race and on Trump, two of the most divisive, explosive, contentious issues?
Mhm.
First of all, who's answering these calls, and what makes you believe that the people will be forthright?
Yeah. David, with the time that we have left, tell me a little bit about your philosophy as it relates to teaching in this climate, because I know that so many people, I think one of the big things that is missed about a second Trump term for a lot of conservatives was hopes that higher ed would be more of a kind of a target of the administration, that reform of some kind was so necessary within that space. And to me, it's one of these elements of American society that really deserves to be gone after hammer and tongs in
Yes.
terms of how terrible an effect it's had, not just broadly, but on kind of the leadership class of America, of churning out people who have learned a lot of untrue things and not been taught a lot of true things. How do you go about approaching teaching students, and how do you believe others should go about approaching teaching in this climate in which that seems to be more and more an area where this critical race theory message and everything else related to it is forced upon people in just in a very aggressive way?
I'll answer your question, but I can't resist answering making a related point. Fine, there will not be a second Trump administration, but it is time for conservatives to get serious about state legislatures. I mean, as you know, higher ed is not a federal issue.
Yes.
The states, including the reddest of states, are funding generously their god awful public universities that are teaching absolute garbage, are funding their public schools. I think there should be, conservatives have played at the state level, but it's mostly been libertarians. It's been about tax cuts and school choice.
Yep.
Um, and I'm fine with both, but there ought to be, if the national politics is not going to yield much in the next few years, there's a lot that can and must be done at the state level. Very aggressive higher ed reform being one of them, school choice, and more broadly curricular reforms. I mean, why not do an audit of every single textbook? Pick the state, I don't know, Arkansas, West Virginia, Idaho, really red states. There shouldn't be a single line in there that is un-American, that teaches students to hate their country. We can deal with the ugly aspects of our past, but put them in a context that this is a fundamentally good and great country, and we should not be teaching the next generation to hate it. There's a lot that needs to be done at the state level that hasn't been done. I point this out again to kind of counter the black pill tendencies of conservatives and disappointed Trumpists. And then you think about the ballot. I don't exactly know what happened right now. I have a lot of questions. A lot of people do. But ballot integrity is something that needs to take place at the state level.
Mhm.
And there needs to be concerted pressure that is put on state legislators who may mean well, but I think they're afraid of the media and of the elites in their state. And conservatives need a much better ground game at the state level. So I felt the need to say that. In
Yes.
terms of how I approach teaching, look, I hate the idea of indoctrination in the classroom. I hate the idea of using the classroom as your soapbox. Finally, I have 20 people who have no choice but to listen to me. So I'm going to, flatter myself by telling them all of my interesting views on everything. I try to be very deferential to the texts we are studying. To no matter how much I disagree with them, I always tell the students, number one priority is understand the authors we're studying. Number two is put them in conversation with one another. And then afterwards, if we have time, you can tell me what you think about this. To me, the goal, I don't always meet it, but would be for students not to know my politics at the end of a class. Now, I have, some sort of a public profile, so it's kind of hard to do that if they sometimes see you on television or listen to the Federalist Radio Hour. But I want them to engage with the ideas. I want them to think, and that if you start to show them your views, it can lead them to just dismiss. So, if we're studying critical race theory, and they know that I'm critical of it, I know why I'm critical of it because I've studied it. I don't want them to just develop a prejudice against it and say, oh, this is dumb because Professor Azerrad thinks it's dumb. I want them to understand it. And if they then reach the conclusion that it's unserious, then that's fine, but they first need to understand it. So I try as best as I can. You can ask my students to what extent I succeed in trying to keep my views out of the classroom and not using the classroom as a soapbox.
Mm-hmm. David, I want to thank you for taking the time to sit down with us again today. How will you be celebrating Thanksgiving if you celebrate the American version of it?
Of course I celebrate the American Thanksgiving. What are you implying? I'm an aspiring American, and next year, God willing, I should be able to get my citizenship is when I'm eligible.
Wonderful.
I'll be celebrating with friends here because I can't go home to Canada because of the crazy quarantine rules in effect in Canada. So I'll be celebrating with friends. But happy Thanksgiving to you and your family and your listeners.
Happy Thanksgiving to you as well, David, and thank you for joining us. I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.